Have you ever argued with yourself and wondered which voice was actually you speaking in that quiet moment? It is a sensation that touches everyone eventually. Psychology suggests that the feeling of being a single unified self is actually a remarkably convincing illusion. As you settle in to explore the hidden architecture of your mind, consider subscribing to stay connected with these nightly journeys. We tend to view our personality as a monolith, a solid statue carved from a single piece of stone, yet the evidence points towards something far more complex and fluid. You are likely a collection of different sub-personalities or distinct parts sharing the same biological housing. This explains why the person you are during a stressful commute feels like a total stranger to the person you become while reading a book on a Sunday morning. It is not merely a mood swing, it is a shift in which internal character holds the floor. This concept is often referred to as polypsychism. It views the human mind not as a kingdom ruled by one monarch, but as a society or a parliament. In this internal assembly, different members hold different values. One faction prioritizes safety and routine, while another craves novelty and risk. The friction you feel when making a difficult choice is literally a debate occurring between these distinct neural networks. This is why you can sincerely promise yourself to save money and then just as sincerely decide to spend it an hour later. Both versions of you were telling the truth, but they simply have different goals and occupy different seats at the table of your consciousness. The idea that we are a multitude is supported by the physical structure of the brain itself. We are not built as a single processor, but rather as a modular system. Evolution has layered new systems on top of old ones, resulting in a brain that processes emotion, logic, and survival instincts in separate, sometimes competing regions. The most striking evidence comes from split brain research, where the two hemispheres of the brain are surgically disconnected. In these cases, it becomes undeniably clear that there are two separate centers of consciousness, each with its own desires and opinions, living quietly side by side. This strange duality in split brain patients points us toward a fascinating concept neuroscientists often call the user illusion. It suggests that the sensation of being a single, unified self located just behind your eyes is actually a sophisticated trick played by the biology of the mind. We instinctively imagine the brain as a strict hierarchy, perhaps resembling a corporation with a single CEO sitting in the control room of the frontal lobes, issuing logical commands to the rest of the body. However, modern mapping of neural pathways reveals that the architecture of the human mind operates much more like a chaotic marketplace or a massive orchestra playing without a conductor. The brain is a modular system, a vast collection of thousands of distinct processing units and subroutines. These modules evolved at different times over millions of years for completely different survival purposes, and they often operate entirely independently of one another. One module tracks social status, another scans for sudden movement, while yet another monitors blood sugar levels, all running simultaneously and silently. The reason we do not feel like a scattered collection of competing impulses is largely due to a specific function found in the left hemisphere, which researchers have dubbed the interpreter. Identified and popularized by the cognitive neuroscientist Michael Gazzaniga, the interpreter is a neural circuit that acts as a tireless storyteller. Its primary job is to observe the automatic actions, sudden feelings, and physical responses generated by the rest of the brain and weave them into a coherent, logical narrative. When you find yourself walking toward the kitchen without really knowing why, and then suddenly tell yourself, "I must be thirsty," that is often the interpreter stepping in retroactively. It rationalizes an impulse that actually originated in a deep, non-verbal, and inaccessible part of your subcortex. In this way, the conscious self acts less like a president making decisions and more like a press secretary whose job is to explain and justify the decisions already made by a hidden administration. The interpreter is a spin doctor, constantly rewriting history milliseconds after it happens to ensure you appear consistent to yourself. It takes the messy, contradictory output of your fear centers, your hunger drives, and your social conditioning, and smooths them over into a sentence starting with, "I decided." This implies that much of what we consider to be our conscious agency is actually just the brain reporting on a choice that was already executed by a silent subsystem. We are not always the captain of the ship. Often we are merely the narrator standing on the deck, describing the voyage and convincing ourselves we're steering. This biological reality explains why we so often struggle with profound internal conflict, feeling like one part of us wants to exercise while another part desperately wants to remain sedentary. We are quite literally of two minds, or perhaps hundreds of minds, arguing over the controls. Long before fMRI machines could visualize these competing networks, human cultures had already intuited this fractured reality. Ancient civilizations did not view the mind as a sealed, singular unit, but rather as a porous vessel, an open space where different spirits or daemons could enter and take the wheel. To the Greeks, this wasn't a literary metaphor. It was a literal description of their cognitive landscape. When a thought arrived unbidden, striking with sudden clarity or warning, it was not perceived as me thinking, but rather as something speaking. Socrates, the father of Western philosophy, provides the most documented example of this relationship. He frequently spoke of his daimonion, a personal divine sign or voice that accompanied him throughout his life. Crucially, this voice operated almost exclusively as a restraint. It rarely told him what to do, but it frequently told him what not to do. It was a sophisticated inhibitory mechanism externalized as a divine guardian, preventing him from making political errors or engaging in conduct that betrayed his principles. It is worth noting that the word daemon in this ancient context carried none of the malevolent baggage of the modern word demon. It simply referred to a guiding spirit or a minor deity, a being that existed in the space between gods and men. This belief in externalized consciousness was not unique to Athens. The Romans held a strikingly similar belief in the genius. Today, we say a person is a genius, implying that exceptional ability is an inherent trait of their biology or personality. But to a Roman, you had a genius. It was a tutelary spirit, a guardian entity born with you that watched over your fortunes and dictated your character. The Roman birthday was actually a celebration of this spirit, involving sacrifices to the genius rather than the human individual. This distinction is profound because it separated the performance from the person. If a poet wrote a transcendent verse, they could not claim total credit, for their genius had whispered it to them. Conversely, if they failed, the burden of shame was shared with this invisible partner. This framework extended to the concept of artistic inspiration, a word that literally means breathing in. To be inspired was to inhale a spirit. The Greeks believed that artists and oracles were essentially hollow reeds through which the muses blew their music. The state of high creativity was technically a state of possession. This is where we get the word enthusiasm, which comes from the Greek entheos, meaning the God within. To be enthusiastic was to be filled with a divine presence that displaced the ordinary self. For centuries, this externalized model preserved human sanity by providing a cosmic explanation for the erratic nature of our inner lives. However, as the scientific revolution took hold and the world underwent what sociologists call disenchantment, these spirits were gradually evicted from the cosmos. They had nowhere to go but inside. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the voices that were once attributed to gods, daemons, and muses were reclassified by the emerging field of psychology. Men like Pierre Genet began to map these autonomous zones not as spirits but as dissociated parts of the psyche. The porous vessel was finally sealed, and the multitude of voices became the burden of the solitary brain. Into this quiet isolation, Sigmund Freud stepped forward to draw a map of the invisible terrain. He proposed that the human mind was not a unified captain steering a ship, but a house divided against itself, populated by three distinct tenants constantly arguing over the controls. He called this the structural model of the psyche, though we know them better by their Latinized names: the id, the ego, and the superego. The deepest and oldest layer is the id. In Freud's original German, he simply called it das Es, or the it, emphasizing its alien, impersonal nature. This is the only part of the personality present at birth, a chaotic reservoir of biological instincts and psychic energy. The id operates entirely on the pleasure principle, demanding immediate satisfaction for every hunger, thirst, or desire. It has no concept of time, no understanding of logic, and absolutely no morality. It is the demanding infant living forever within the adult brain, crying out for what it wants regardless of the consequences or social propriety. Standing in direct opposition to this primitive force is the superego, or the over-I. This structure develops later in childhood as we internalize the voices of our parents, teachers, and cultural expectations. The superego operates on the morality principle, striving not for happiness but for perfection. It acts as the stern judge in the courtroom of the mind, dispensing feelings of guilt and shame when we stray from the rules, and a sense of pride when we behave. It is often just as irrational as the id, demanding a rigid level of purity and control that is nearly impossible for a living human being to maintain. Caught in the violent crossfire between these two extremes is the ego, or simply the I. This is the part of the psyche most of us identify as our conscious self. The ego is the exhausted diplomat, tasked with the nearly impossible job of satisfying the wild, selfish demands of the id without triggering the harsh punishment of the superego, all while navigating the physical limitations of the real world. It operates on the reality principle, learning to delay gratification and find safe, socially acceptable ways to release tension. When you feel a sudden urge to be rude but choose a polite response instead, that is your ego successfully negotiating a peace treaty between your instincts and your conscience. Freud believed that much of human anxiety arises from the strain of this internal friction. To keep the peace, the ego creates defense mechanisms, invisible shields like denial, repression, or projection, to distort reality just enough to reduce the stress of the conflict. What we outwardly display as our unique personality is, in this view, simply the specific strategy our ego has developed to survive the war raging inside our own heads. While Freud viewed the unconscious primarily as a personal dumping ground for repressed memories and forbidden drives, his one-time heir apparent, Carl Jung, looked into that same darkness and saw something far more ancient and expansive. Jung broke away from the strict biological determinism of Freudian psychoanalysis because he believed our internal landscape wasn't just shaped by our specific childhoods, but by the history of the human species itself. Central to Jung's map of the soul is the concept of the shadow. This is perhaps the most famous and misunderstood of the internal personalities he described. The shadow consists of every part of ourselves that we reject, deny, or hide because it doesn't fit the image we want to present to the world. It is the long, heavy bag we drag behind us, filled with selfishness, aggression, jealousy, and socially unacceptable desires. However, Jung insisted the shadow is not inherently evil.
It is simply the dark side, meaning the obscured side, much like the side of the moon we never see from Earth. It holds not only our worst impulses, but also our primitive vitality, spontaneity, and creative energy that polite society often forces us to suppress. This brings up a fascinating aspect of our own internal lives, and I'm curious if you have ever felt that sudden tug of a shadow side, a sudden urge to act completely out of character, or a hidden desire that surprises you with its intensity. If you feel comfortable sharing, let me know in the comments what kind of traits or impulses you think might be hiding in your own shadow. Deeper still within the Jungian framework live the contrasexual personalities known as the anima and the animus. Jung observed that a man's unconscious mind often holds an inner feminine personality, the anima, which personifies his emotional life, sensitivity, and capacity for connection. Conversely, a woman's unconscious holds the animus, an inner masculine personality representing logic, conviction, and spirit. These aren't just abstract concepts or metaphors. In Jung's view, they act like distinct semi-autonomous people living inside us. A man possessed by his anima might become unexpectedly moody and sentimental, while a woman possessed by her animus might become obstinate and fiercely argumentative. The goal of psychological growth, which Jung called individuation, is to meet these inner figures, acknowledge them, and integrate them, rather than letting them drive the car from the back seat. Beyond these personal figures lies the deepest layer of all, the collective unconscious, where the archetypes reside. Think of archetypes as universal, pre-existing molds for personalities that every human inherits at birth, much like we inherit the pattern for having 2 arms and 2 legs. They are the reason we instantly recognize the character of the hero, the wise old man, the trickster, or the great mother, whether they appear in a modern blockbuster movie or a myth from a culture we have never studied. These internal personalities are not unique to you. They are ancient roles waiting in the wings of your mind, ready to step onto the stage when life calls for them. When you act with sudden uncharacteristic bravery, Jung might say you are momentarily embodying the hero archetype. When you find yourself nurturing a stranger with distinct intensity, the mother archetype is acting through you. We are, in this sense, a walking collection of ancient ghosts, each vying for a moment in the light of consciousness. While Jung looked at the collective history of humanity, a Canadian psychiatrist named Eric Berne decided to look at the specific history of the individual. In the 1950s, Berne proposed that our internal world isn't just a swirl of ancient myths, but a structured system of playback recordings. He called this framework transactional analysis, and it simplifies the complexity of the human personality into 3 distinct ego states that exist in all of us. These states act as physical realities within the brain, dictating how we interact with the world. The first state is what Berne called the parent. This is a massive collection of recordings in your brain of unquestioned or imposed external events perceived by a person in their early years. Roughly between birth and age 5, everything you saw your parents or guardians do and everything they said was recorded straight onto this internal tape. It includes all the warnings, the rules, the admonitions, and the comforting gestures. When you are in the parent state, you are essentially borrowing the personality of those who raised you. If you find yourself fussing over someone's jacket being zipped up or sternly judging a driver who cuts you off, you are replaying the recording of an authority figure from decades ago. You aren't just acting like your father or mother. In that moment, neurologically, you become them. Simultaneous to this recording of external rules is the recording of internal feelings known as the child state. While the parent is the recording of what happened outside, the child is the recording of what you felt inside in response to those events. It captures the vast frustration, the intense joy, the fear of abandonment, and the boundless creativity of the little person you once were. When an adult is in the child state, they aren't merely being childish or immature in a negative sense. They might be accessing intuition, spontaneity, and the capacity for enjoyment. However, if you feel a sudden, crushing wave of shame when you make a small mistake at work, that is the child ego state taking over, replaying an old feeling of being small and helpless in the face of a giant world. Have you ever noticed yourself reacting to a minor problem with a disproportionately childish emotion, only to wonder later where that feeling came from? Finally, there is the adult. This is the state that differentiates us from the purely reactive. The adult is necessary for survival. It processes data and computes the probabilities which are essential for dealing with the outside world effectively. While the parent is taught and the child is felt, the adult is thought. It functions like a cold, rational computer, examining the data of the current moment without the emotional clutter of the past. It decides whether it is actually safe to cross the street, regardless of the parent's warning or the child's fear. The true fascination of this model lies in how rapidly we switch between these roles. You can be in the adult state 1 second, discussing a budget calmly, and then, triggered by a specific tone of voice, snap instantly into the child state, feeling defensive and sulky. Or perhaps you shift into the parent state, becoming critical and authoritative. Berne argued that psychological health isn't about erasing the parent or the child, but about strengthening the adult so it can mediate between them. We are constantly navigating this internal committee where a scolded toddler, a strict disciplinarian, and a rational computer are all trying to grab the microphone. This concept of the adult state processing reality leads us to consider how our brains handle the friction between what we feel and what we know. This friction is exactly where psychologists Hal and Sidra Stone focused their attention starting in the 1970s. They moved beyond the idea of a singular solid ego and proposed that our psyche is actually a crowded room of distinct subpersonalities, a framework they developed into the voice dialogue method. In their view, we are not one consistent thing, but many, and the personality that drives you to succeed at work might be entirely different from the one that craves comfort and safety at home. They categorized these subpersonalities into a specific dynamic arrangement that governs our lives. First, there are the primary selves. Think of these as your psychological operating system, or the armor you wear to face the world. These are the traits you rely on to navigate reality safely. The responsible one, the perfectionist, the caretaker, or the rational analyst. These parts usually developed very early in life to protect the vulnerable inner child from pain, criticism, or rejection. We usually identify completely with our primary selves, believing they are simply who we are rather than a set of adaptive behaviors we learned to perform. However, the Stones postulated that for every primary self that dominates our behavior, there is an equal and opposite energy that we have pushed away. These are the disowned selves. The laws of psychology, much like physics, suggest that energy cannot be destroyed, only repressed. So if your primary self is the hard worker who values productivity above all else, you have likely disowned your lazy or hedonistic self. You might find yourself irrationally irritated by people who seem idle, precisely because that part of you has been locked in the basement of your subconscious. The disowned self represents the lost potential and the shadow side of our personality, waiting for a moment of weakness or extreme stress to burst out. The practical application of voice dialogue is fascinating because it changes the grammar of therapy. A facilitator effectively asks to interview these parts directly.
They do not want to hear you talk about your anxiety. They want you to let the anxious part take the microphone. You might physically move to a different chair to embody that sub-personality completely. When a person speaks as their inner critic or as their inner child, their voice tone, posture, and vocabulary often change dramatically. This physical and mental separation allows for the emergence of what the Stones called the aware ego. The aware ego is not a part itself, but a conscious middle ground, a conductor capable of holding the tension between the primary and disowned selves without being hijacked by either.
It is the difference between being a car driven by an erratic autopilot and being a driver who can listen to the passengers but ultimately holds the wheel. This experiential approach of distinguishing the core self from its protective components laid the vital groundwork for perhaps the most influential modern framework in this field. While the Stones focused on the dynamic dance between opposing energies, a therapist named Richard Schwartz began noticing a specific, repeatable structural pattern in how these parts organize themselves, leading to the development of internal family systems. In the early 1980s, Dr. Richard Schwartz was working as a family systems therapist, focusing his energy on the external dynamics between parents and children. He was attempting to help clients with severe bulimia and anorexia, yet he found himself hitting a persistent wall. The standard techniques of fixing the external family environment simply were not stopping the destructive behaviors. Out of frustration, he began asking his clients what was actually happening inside their minds just before a binge or a purge. They didn't describe a singular urge or a lack of willpower. Instead, they described an internal conversation. They spoke of parts of themselves, distinct inner voices that would argue, debate, and control them. At first, this language alarmed him. In the clinical world of the time, hearing voices was often a red flag for severe pathology, perhaps even schizophrenia. But as Schwartz set aside his diagnostic manuals and simply listened, he recognized something familiar. These were not hallucinations. They were the same conflicting impulses we all experience, just polarized to an extreme degree. A client might say, "There is a part of me that wants to starve to feel in control, and another part that hates me when I eat." Schwartz realized these internal entities were relating to one another exactly like the external families he had been trained to treat. They had rules, secrets, alliances, and feuds. The mind was not a monolith, it was a literal internal family system. The most radical shift occurred when Schwartz stopped trying to fight these parts. In traditional therapy, a binging part or a self-harming part was viewed as a symptom to be eliminated. But one day, when he asked a client's internal critic why it was being so harsh, the client relayed the answer, "It says if it doesn't scream at me to be perfect, I will get hurt again." It was a revelation. He realized even the most destructive parts were driven by a benevolent intent. They were like soldiers who had been at war so long they forgot how to lay down their weapons. This moved the framework away from the medical model of symptoms to be cured towards a model of inhabitants to be understood. This concept that there are no bad parts became the cornerstone of the entire philosophy. As he mapped this internal terrain, a clear taxonomy emerged. The internal family was not random chaos, it was highly organized. Just as a functioning society has guards, firefighters, and vulnerable citizens, the mind organizes its sub-personalities into specific roles to manage pain and ensure survival. Schwartz identified three primary categories of parts that emerge in response to life experiences. There are the wounded parts that hold our pain, the reactive parts that douse the flames of distress, and the proactive parts that try to prevent the fire from starting in the first place. To understand how this system operates, we must first look at the proactive controllers, the parts responsible for your daily stability and safety. In the IFS model, these are called the managers. Managers are the architects of your daily stability, the proactive protectors who stand at the gate of your consciousness with a singular, unyielding mission: to ensure that you are never hurt, embarrassed, or rejected again. While the exiled parts of the psyche carry the heavy burdens of past trauma, the managers are the ones who work tirelessly to keep those exiles safely locked away in the basement, ensuring their cries are never heard by the outside world or felt by the conscious mind. They operate under a strict code of preemptive control, functioning as the dutiful sentries who scan the horizon for any sign of danger. This danger is rarely physical in the modern world. Instead, it is emotional. It is the threat of criticism, the sting of sudden failure, or the ache of abandonment. To prevent these painful feelings from surfacing, managers adopt rigid, often repetitive strategies. They dictate how you act, what you say, and how you present yourself, carefully curating a persona that seems acceptable and safe to the world around you. They are the internal voice that urges you to check your work one more time, to smile when you actually feel angry, or to remain silent when you desperately want to speak. One of the most recognizable manifestations of this energy is the controller. This part operates on the firm belief that if you can simply master every variable in your environment, you will remain safe. It organizes, plans, and directs your life, often with an intensity that can feel rigid or stifling. Yet, it does not exert this pressure to be difficult. It does so because it fundamentally believes that chaos is dangerous. It fears that if it lets go of the steering wheel for even a second, the painful emotions it guards against might flood in and overwhelm you. Alongside the controller often stands the perfectionist. This manager operates on the premise that if you are flawless, you are beyond reproach. It pushes you to achieve, to polish every detail, and to never show weakness. It seeks safety through validation and accomplishment, hoping that if you are good enough, smart enough, or successful enough, you will be loved, and the deep-seated fear of worthlessness held by the exiles will never be triggered. Similarly, the caretaker or people-pleaser tries to ensure safety by managing the emotions of everyone else. It anticipates the needs of others before they are even spoken, sacrificing your own boundaries to maintain harmony, believing that conflict is a threat to survival. While these strategies often help us function and achieve high status in the external world, they come at a significant metabolic cost. The energy required to maintain these facades is immense. Managers are often chronically exhausted, carrying a heavy load of responsibility that they feel they cannot put down. They live in a state of high alert vigilance, always looking outward to manage perceptions while frantically pressing down on the internal doors where the pain resides. However, despite their relentless efforts, managers cannot control every aspect of reality. Life is inherently unpredictable. Eventually, a criticism lands too hard, a relationship fractures, or a sudden failure occurs that is too large to ignore. When the manager's proactive defenses are finally breached and the exile's pain begins to bleed through, the internal system must instantly resort to a much more desperate, reactive, and volatile set of measures to extinguish the pain. This brings us to the urgent, high-intensity responders within the psyche known as the firefighters. While the managers are proactive, carefully constructing a life that avoids triggers, the firefighters are entirely reactive, often remaining dormant until the very moment the red alert sounds. They have no interest in the long-term consequences of their actions, nor do they care about your 5-year plan or your social reputation. Their perspective is tunnel-visioned on the immediate present, and their mandate is absolute: douse the flames of emotion before they consume the system. When the exile's pain breaks through, that sudden stab of rejection, fear, or ancient shame, the firefighter launches a rescue mission that is often chaotic and indiscriminate. To the outside world, and even to your own conscious mind, these rescue missions often look like self-sabotage. They manifest as the sudden, inexplicable urge to binge eat until the physical sensation of fullness overrides the emotional emptiness. They appear as the compulsion to doom scroll for hours, flooding the brain with dopamine until a soothing fog dissociates you from reality. They can look like sudden outbursts of rage that push loved ones away, or the immediate reach for a chemical that provides a chemical curtain against the hurt. Because these behaviors are often messy, destructive, or socially unacceptable, we tend to villainize them. We view them as a lack of willpower, a moral failing, or a weakness of character. However, viewing them through the lens of internal logic reveals a heroic, albeit desperate, intention. The firefighter acts on the belief that the emotional pain of the exile is a literal threat to survival. If the choice is between burning down the kitchen or letting the whole house collapse from the structural failure of grief, the firefighter will choose the kitchen every time. They are not trying to hurt you, they are trying to numb you. They are offering immediate anesthesia for a surgery you didn't ask for. They are the chaotic guardians who jump on the grenade to save the rest of the platoon, even if the explosion leaves a mess. This drastic approach naturally puts them at war with the managers. The managers, who worship order, control, and social approval, view the firefighters as their sworn enemies. You might experience this as a vicious internal cycle. A manager part works tirelessly to maintain a strict diet or a perfect professional image, keeping everything tight and controlled. Then a trigger hits and a firefighter takes over to soothe the pain with a binge or an emotional outburst.
Once the smoke clears, the manager returns, horrified by the loss of control, and attacks with shaming thoughts and harsh self-criticism. Crucially, this shame itself is painful, which often triggers the firefighter to come back and numb the shame the manager just created. It is a polarity of order and chaos, effectively trapping the person in a loop of restriction and rebellion. Yet both sides are driven by the same fear, fiercely protecting the one thing they cannot bear to face. That thing is the exile. Deep beneath the frenetic energy of the manager and the reactive chaos of the firefighter, there lie the most tender, vulnerable parts of the psyche. In the internal family systems model, these are known as exiles, and they are almost always young children. They are the parts of you that were stopped in time, frozen at the specific moment that a hurt occurred. It might have been a moment of abuse, a profound rejection, or simply a time when you felt frighteningly alone and no one came to help. Because the mind of a child cannot process such overwhelming intensity, the system does the only thing it can to survive. It isolates the part experiencing the pain. They are cast into the dungeon of the subconscious. This separation is not done out of malice, but out of a desperate necessity to keep the rest of the system running. The protectors act as the jailers, believing that if these exiles were allowed to roam free, their pain would consume the entire person, rendering them unable to function in daily life. And so they are locked away. But they are not just locked away with their memories, they are locked away with their burdens. A burden in this context is distinctive from the part itself. It is an extreme belief or heavy emotion that the part has absorbed from the trauma, clinging to it like a heavy cloak. These burdens are often heavy sacks filled with toxic shame, abject terror, or the crushing conviction of unworthiness. The exile creates a narrative that says, "I am bad, I am unlovable, or I am not safe," and they hold on to this belief with a desperate, unwavering grip, confusing this foreign weight with their own identity. Yet despite being hidden in the dark, exiles are not dormant. They are desperate to be known. They ache for someone to come down to the basement, listen to their story, and tell them that the danger has passed. This leads to a phenomenon therapists call flooding. When a current life event echoes the past, perhaps a harsh tone of voice from a partner or a sudden feeling of exclusion at work, the locks on the dungeon momentarily fail. The exile sees an opening and rushes toward the surface, bringing all their frozen pain with them in an attempt to finally be heard. Suddenly, you aren't just annoyed, you are engulfed in a tidal wave of grief or panic that feels entirely disproportionate to the situation. To the conscious mind, this feels like an emotional breakdown. To the protectors, it is a catastrophic breach. They immediately rush in to shove the exile back down, using distraction, numbness, or rage to silence the crying child. This creates a tragic reinforced cycle. The harder the exile tries to be heard, the more forcefully they are suppressed, confirming their belief that they are unwanted and shameful. They remain stuck in the past, unaware that the person they belong to has grown up, unaware that there are now resources and strength available that did not exist when they were 5. They are waiting for a savior, not realizing that the savior is already here, existing within the very system that imprisons them. This brings us to the center of the storm, the one entity in the internal family that is neither a protector nor an exile, but the healing agent capable of entering the dungeon without fear. This agent is what Richard Schwartz came to call the self, distinguished with a capital S. In this internal landscape, the self is not just another character on the stage, it is the stage itself,
or perhaps more accurately, the compassionate audience that has been waiting for the play to resolve. Unlike the managers who are driven by a need for control, or the firefighters who act on impulse to douse emotional flames, the self possesses no agenda other than connection and harmony. It is the seat of consciousness that remains when all the defensive layers are asked to step back. Identifying this state involves recognizing a specific frequency of energy, often summarized by therapists through 8 qualities that spontaneously emerge when the parts relax. The first of these is a profound calm, a grounding stillness that persists even in the face of internal chaos. This is followed by clarity, the ability to see situations without the distortion of past fears, and curiosity, a genuine, non-judgmental interest in why a specific part is acting the way it is. When the self is in the driver's seat, it does not hate the anxiety or the anger. It becomes curious about them both. This curiosity naturally gives way to compassion, extending warmth toward the wounded exiles and the exhausted protectors alike.
The self also exhibits confidence, a trust in its own ability to handle the internal world, along with courage to approach painful memories, creativity to solve problems that seemed impossible to the rigid minds of the defensive parts, and finally, connectedness, a sense of belonging to the wider world. A fundamental tenet of this perspective is that the core self is indestructible. It cannot be damaged, fragmented, or corrupted by trauma, no matter how severe the life history. It is often compared to the sun behind a heavy layer of storm clouds. While the clouds, representing trauma, defenses, and extreme emotions, may obscure the sun for days or even decades, the sun itself remains radiant and untouched. The goal of internal work is not to create a new self, but simply to help the parts separate or unblend, allowing the clouds to part so the inherent light can shine through once again. In this restored system, the self acts as the conductor of an orchestra. It does not silence the drums of the protector or banish the weeping violins of the exile. Instead, it directs them, ensuring that the drums do not drown out the melody and that every instrument contributes to a harmonious symphony rather than a discordant noise. However, the human mind is capable of creating separations far more rigid than these permeable internal parts. When the walls between these internal states are built not of permeable mist, but of reinforced steel, usually to survive repetitive and overwhelming early trauma, we move further along the spectrum of separation. We leave the realm of functional parts and enter the complex, often misunderstood territory where these internal facets gain their own autonomy, names, and distinct histories, transitioning from internal family systems into the reality of dissociative identity. To understand how a single mind can house multiple distinct identities, we must first look at the mechanism that makes separation possible. Dissociation is rarely a binary switch where one is either fully present or completely fractured, but rather exists on a vast and sliding scale. At its most fundamental level, dissociation is simply the brain's ability to disconnect attention from immediate experience. It is a biological safety valve, a way for the mind to signal that the current reality is too boring, too repetitive, or perhaps too overwhelming to fully inhabit. Almost every human being on the planet dissociates to some degree without realizing it is happening. You might know this sensation best as the phenomenon of highway hypnosis. This occurs when a person drives a vehicle for great distances, navigating traffic, obeying signals, and maintaining speed, yet arrives at their destination with absolutely no memory of the intervening miles. In this state, a distinct part of the consciousness takes the wheel, quite literally, handling complex motor skills and split-second decisions, while the primary conscious self drifts away into thoughts of dinner,
work, or memories of the past. The driver is not asleep, but they are not fully there in the integrated sense. The part of the mind operating the car acts as a temporary functional separation, a sophisticated autopilot that proves the brain can run complex programs without the central executive being in the office. Moving deeper along this spectrum, we encountered the vivid inner worlds of maladaptive daydreaming. For some, the act of spacing out becomes a compulsive, immersive experience where the internal narrative feels more substantial than the external world. While not necessarily a fractured identity, this state demonstrates the brain's profound capacity to prioritize internal reality over external sensory input. The brain effectively dampens the signals from the eyes and ears, turning up the volume on the internal theater until the characters in a daydream feel emotionally real and present. This ability to partition experience is a survival adaptation rooted in our biology. When an animal is caught in the jaws of a predator with no hope of escape, it will often go limp, entering a state of freeze where pain is numbed and consciousness is distanced from the body. Humans share this primitive defense. When we face trauma that we cannot fight or flee from, the mind escapes by fragmenting. This leads us to the concept of structural dissociation. Unlike the temporary and voluntary drift of highway hypnosis, structural dissociation implies a more rigid and permanent divide. The mind creates a barrier between the apparently normal part, which handles daily life, going to work and engaging in small talk, and the emotional part, which holds the traumatic memory and the intense survival reactions associated with it. The wall between these parts becomes thick and opaque. The person going to work may have total amnesia for the feelings held by the emotional part, unaware that a segment of their own history is locked away in a separate room of the mind. This is where the spectrum shifts from a universal human quirk into the architecture of complex identity. It is not just about zoning out anymore. It's about the brain constructing distinct, walled-off containers to hold experiences that are simply too heavy for one pair of hands to carry alone. When the weight becomes unbearable, the mind makes a radical decision to survive. For decades, pop culture and early psychiatry labeled this phenomenon multiple personality disorder, painting a picture of several distinct people inhabiting one body. However, in 1994, the psychiatric community made a critical shift, renaming the condition dissociative identity disorder. This was not just a bureaucratic update, it was a fundamental correction of our understanding. The term multiple personalities implied that a person had grown too many identities, like a garden with too many different trees. The reality of DID is actually the opposite. It is not about having more than one personality, but rather having less than one single integrated whole. This fragmentation is best understood through the theory of structural dissociation. In this framework, the personality divides into two primary categories to handle an impossible reality. First, there are the apparently normal parts, or ANPs. These parts of the mind are tasked with the daily grind of survival, going to school, completing chores, interacting with neighbors, and maintaining a facade of normalcy. They are often entirely numb to the trauma, allowing the individual to function in the world without being incapacitated by pain. Then, hidden behind strong amnesic walls are the emotional parts, or EPs. These parts hold the terrifying memories, the physical sensations of pain, and the overwhelming fear that the ANP cannot afford to feel. It creates a system where a person can effectively be two places at once, mentally present in a safe classroom while psychologically sequestered in a traumatic memory. This separation is not a sign of a broken mind, but rather a brilliant creative adaptation. It occurs because human children are not born with a fully formed singular personality. We are born as a loose collection of ego states. One state feels hunger, another feels tired, another wants to play. In a typical development, these states fuse together between the ages of 7 and 9, knitting into a cohesive I. However, if a child experiences repetitive, overwhelming trauma during those formative years, usually at the hands of a caregiver, that fusion is interrupted. The mind realizes that to survive, it must keep the child who was loved separate from the child who was hurt. Therefore, DID is not a shattering of a once whole mirror. It is a mosaic that never got the chance to be glued together. The brain builds walls between these states to preserve an attachment to the caregiver, which is biologically necessary for a child's survival. As the child grows, these separate states develop their own patterns, mannerisms, and memories, becoming the distinct alters that characterize the disorder. Yet, this condition exists on a spectrum, and not everyone who experiences this fragmentation fits the rigid criteria of DID. This brings us to a diagnosis known as OSDD, or Other Specified Dissociative Disorder. This category captures the nuance of the human mind, where the walls between parts might be a little thinner. For example, in OSDD-1B, an individual may have very distinct, separate parts, different voices, ages, or preferences, but they do not suffer from the blackout amnesia that defines classic DID. They might switch between parts, but retain a continuous memory of what happened, feeling as though they were watching their body act from the passenger seat. Conversely, in OSDD-1A, the parts may be less distinct, feeling like different versions of the same person rather than different people entirely, but the amnesia remains severe. Both DID and OSDD represent the mind's profound capacity to compartmentalize reality when reality itself becomes too dangerous to hold. When this separation stabilizes, it often manifests as a structured internal environment known to the community as the headspace or inner world. For those without a dissociative disorder, this might sound like a vivid daydream, but for a system, the headspace is often experienced as a concrete, three-dimensional reality that exists parallel to the external world. It is the place where alters reside when they are not currently controlling the body, a state often referred to as being away or inside. The diversity of these internal landscapes is as limitless as the human imagination itself, governed by its own internal physics and logic. Some systems perceive their internal organization through the lens of a high-tech control room, not unlike a ship's bridge or cockpit. In this visualization, the body is the vehicle, and the alter currently in charge, or fronting, is the one sitting in the pilot's chair holding the controls. Others who are near the front, perhaps co-conscious or watching what is happening externally, might be standing behind the pilot's chair, observing the monitors that represent the eyes and ears. This functional structure helps the mind organize exactly who has executive control at any given moment and who is stepping back to rest. However, the imagery can be far more organic and domestic. Many systems visualize a large house or a sprawling castle where each distinct personality has their own bedroom, a private sanctuary where they can retreat and be themselves without the pressures of the outside world. In these rooms, an alter who presents as a child might play with toys that don't exist physically, while a protector personality might spend their time in a gym or an armory. In polyfragmented systems, which may host hundreds of fragments, the inner world might resemble a vast city, a series of islands in an endless ocean, or even an entire galaxy, allowing for the necessary separation between groups of alters who may not get along or who hold conflicting trauma memories. It is fascinating to consider how we organize our own minds, even without these clinical conditions.
I'm curious if you have a version of this yourself. Do you utilize a mind palace or a specific imaginary sanctuary to organize your thoughts or simply to relax? I'd love to read about your internal architecture in the comments. For a system, this architecture is vital for internal communication, which is the bridge to functionality. If two alters cannot speak directly via voice, they might visualize leaving written notes on a whiteboard in a shared headspace kitchen, or communicate through shared projected images. When the internal landscape is chaotic or frightening, perhaps reflecting the trauma that created it, a primary goal of therapy is often to consciously renovate this space. A therapist might guide the system to visualize a safe, neutral meeting place, like a conference room with a round table or a quiet, sunlit garden. This creates a stabilizing platform where different parts can meet to negotiate time at the front, share vital information, and resolve conflicts, slowly transforming an internal battleground into a cooperative community. Within this cooperative community, the residents often bear little resemblance to one another, creating a vibrant, complex tapestry of identities that defies simple categorization. It is a common misconception that all alternate personalities are merely variations of the host, but the reality is far more intricate. You might find distinct ages, genders, voices, and even physical sensations that differ wildly from the body's actual biology. Among the most misunderstood of these internal residents are those clinically referred to as persecutors. To an outside observer, or even to the host, these parts can seem antagonistic, perhaps sabotaging relationships or mimicking the harsh words of past abusers. However, in the compassionate view of therapy, these figures are often revealed to be misguided protectors. They learned early on that the world was unsafe, and they adopted a strategy of harsh discipline to prevent the child from making mistakes that might attract danger. Their logic is often rooted in the idea that if they punish the system first, the outside world won't have to, making their aggression a desperate, paradoxical form of defense designed to ensure survival. In stark contrast to these hardened defenders are the littles, the internal children who often hold the memories and feelings that were too overwhelming for a developing mind to process. These alters may perceive themselves as being stuck at a specific age, 3, 5, or 7 years old, effectively frozen in time. When a little is present, the body's voice may change, becoming higher and softer, and the adult system might suddenly feel an intense craving for comfort items, coloring books, or cartoons. They are the keepers of innocence, but also the holders of deep, fragile pain, separated from the rest of the system so the adult self can function in daily life without being constantly flooded by the terrifying vulnerability of childhood. Overseeing these interactions are the gatekeepers, the vigilant observers who act as the system's internal traffic controllers. These unique alters often possess the ability to control who comes to the front and when, preventing the system from switching chaotically or at inappropriate times. More importantly, gatekeepers often hold the keys to memory access, maintaining the amnesiac barriers that keep traumatic memories contained until the system is robust enough to process them. They are the librarians of the mind, ensuring that information is only released when it is safe to do so. Perhaps the most fascinating illustration of the mind's creative power is the presence of non-human alters. It is not uncommon for a system to contain alters that present as animals, fantasy creatures, or even robotic entities. A child suffering through a situation where emotions were dangerous might develop a robot alter, a part that feels nothing, functions mechanically, and can endure without breaking. Similarly, a child who felt small and powerless might generate a wolf or a dragon alter, a fierce guardian possessing the strength necessary to survive a predator. These forms are not random, they are symbolic solutions to impossible problems, representing the mind's profound capacity to construct exactly what was needed to survive the unsurvivable.
When these internal guardians step forward to take charge of the physical body, the process is technically known as fronting. It is the mechanism by which an alter moves into the executive position of consciousness, effectively becoming the primary agent interacting with the external world. For the person experiencing it, the sensation of switching can be incredibly varied and deeply internal. Some describe it as a sudden, jarring dislocation, similar to the feeling of waking up in a room you do not remember entering, while others report a slow, dissolving sensation, as if they are fading into the background like a mist, while another presence gently overlays their own. One of the most complex and difficult aspects of this transition is the phenomenon of lost time. Dissociative barriers act as high walls between these different parts of the self, creating distinct compartments of memory. When a full switch occurs, the part that steps back into the inner world may experience total amnesia, effectively blinking out of existence for minutes, hours, or even days. This is not merely forgetting a detail like misplacing keys, it is a complete gap in the autobiographical narrative, a missing chapter in the story of one's life. These amnesiac barriers were originally erected as a vital safety measure, ensuring that the host personality remained unaware of the trauma being endured by the protective alter, allowing daily life to continue uninterrupted by the memory of pain. However, the experience of multiplicity is not always defined by blackouts and hard separations. The mind is capable of a fascinating state known as co-consciousness, where two or more parts share the front simultaneously. You might visualize this as a car with dual controls. One part may be handling the steering and the pedals, managing the physical body and speech, while another sits in the passenger seat, observing the road, offering commentary, or sharing the visual input. In this state of co-consciousness, memory is often shared, or at least accessible, creating a continuous thread of awareness despite the simultaneous presence of multiple perspectives. Even when an alter does not fully take the front, they can exert what is known as passive influence. This is a subtle, often confusing intrusion, where the person currently in control feels emotions, urges, or physical sensations that do not feel like their own. A sudden, unexplained wave of deep grief might wash over someone who was feeling perfectly fine just moments before, signaling that a younger part is close to the surface, leaking their emotional reality into the conscious mind. It can also manifest as sudden skill fluctuation. A person might momentarily lose the ability to drive or read if a very young alter is influencing the body, or conversely, they might find themselves knowing how to navigate a complex situation with a confidence they do not usually possess, borrowing the strength of a protector without fully switching. These physiological adaptations are profound, with researchers noting that distinct alters can even exhibit different heart rate variability, vision prescriptions, or allergic reactions, proving that the body adapts physically to the mind currently in command. This physical adaptation is mirrored by a psychological one, particularly when we look at where these distinct personalities come from. Many alters are what clinicians call introjects, meaning they're internalized representations of outside people. This mechanism is often a survival strategy. For example, a system might develop an introject based on an abuser. While this sounds counterintuitive, the mind creates this figure to enforce the abuser's rules internally, hoping that by strictly policing behavior from the inside, they can avoid triggering real punishment from the outside. Conversely, introjects can be modeled after positive figures, a nurturing teacher, a kind neighbor, or a protective relative, providing the child with a constant source of comfort and guidance that was lacking in their physical environment. The mind's ability to borrow templates for survival extends beyond real people into the realm of fiction. These alters are known as fictives, based on characters from books, movies, mythology, or other media. While it might seem surprising to encounter an internal personality modeled after a superhero, a wizard, or a television character, the logic behind it is profound. When a traumatized mind feels utterly powerless, it searches for a symbol of strength or resilience. If a child sees a character who is brave, invincible, or socially skilled, the brain may use that character as a blueprint to construct an alter who possesses those exact necessary traits. It's a resourceful way to access courage or specialized skills that the individual feels they do not possess on their own. Importantly, fictives usually understand that their source memories, the plot of the story they come from, are distinct from the system's objective reality. Their identity is a valid vessel for real emotions and roles within the system, even if the template was borrowed from a story. This immense creativity highlights how the brain constructs companionship and defense mechanisms out of whatever materials are available. However, while clinical diagnoses like DID are rooted in trauma, there's a wider community that experiences plurality differently. This brings us to the concept of non-traumagenic systems, often referred to as endogenic, challenging the idea that trauma is the only pathway to becoming many.
One of the most fascinating intersections of this non-traumagenic plurality is found in the history of tulpomancy. While the term today describes a specific subculture of people who intentionally create sentient companions within their minds, its roots stretch back centuries to the snowy peaks of the Himalayas. The word itself is derived from the Tibetan term sprulpa, which loosely translates to an emanation or a magical manifestation. In traditional Tibetan mysticism, specifically within the Vajrayana practices, creating a mind-made body was not a recreational activity or coping mechanism, but a rigorous spiritual discipline. High-ranking monks and yogis would spend hours in deep meditation, visualizing a deity or a figure with such intense focus that the image would eventually seem to separate from the mind of the creator and appear as a visible reality. The original goal of this practice was paradoxically not to create a friend, but to prove that reality itself is an illusion. If a monk could build a sentient being out of pure thought, and that being felt just as real as a neighbor or a tree, then it served as proof that the material world was just as malleable and empty as the thought form itself. However, the Western understanding of this concept took a sharp turn in the early 20th century, largely due to the writings of the Belgian-French explorer and spiritualist Alexandra David Neal. In her 1929 book, Magic and Mystery in Tibet, David Neal claimed to be the first Western woman to enter the forbidden city of Lhasa. More intriguingly, she described her own experiment with these methods. She decided to create a tulpa, but rather than a deity, she visualized a jovial, fat monk, somewhat like a Friar Tuck figure. After months of intense concentration, she reported that the monk began to appear to her as a hallucination, initially performing the actions she intended. But then something strange happened. The figure began to act on its own accord. It developed distinct mannerisms she had not consciously imagined, and eventually became mischievous, even appearing to other members of her traveling party. The experiment turned sour when the jolly monk became sinister, forcing her to spend 6 grueling months performing mental exercises to reabsorb the figure and dissolve it back into her psyche. This account fundamentally shifted the definition of a tulpa in the Western imagination. It moved the concept from a strictly religious emancipation technique to a phenomenon of psychological autonomy. It introduced the idea that the human mind is capable of fracturing itself intentionally, creating a separate consciousness that can think, feel, and act independently of the host's original intent. This distinction is vital in understanding the modern phenomenon. A tulpa is not merely an imaginary friend. An imaginary friend is fully controlled by the creator. You decide what they say and do. A tulpa, by definition, possesses perceived sentience. They surprise you. They can argue, tell jokes you didn't think of, and offer emotional support from a perspective that feels entirely alien to your own.
For decades, this remained a niche topic in occult circles and theosophy, often grouped with ghosts or psychic projection. But the internet age brought about a bizarre and rapid evolution. Around 2009, on anonymous image boards, users began rediscovering David Neal's techniques. Curiously, this resurgence was heavily driven by fans of animated media who sought to bring their favorite characters to life in a mental space. What began as roleplay evolved into a serious psychological practice, stripping away the Tibetan mysticism and replacing it with terminology from neuroscience and cognitive behavioral therapy, laying the groundwork for the modern secular tulpamancy community we see today. This contemporary approach views the creation of a tulpa not as a supernatural invocation, but a deliberate, systematic hacking of one's own psychology. The primary method used to achieve this is called forcing, a term that encompasses two distinct types of mental labor. There is active forcing, which requires the host to sit in meditation, focusing entirely on visualizing the tulpa's form, personality, and voice. This is often done within a constructed mental environment known as a wonderland, a persistent imaginary space where the host and tulpa can interact. The detail required here is immense. Practitioners don't just imagine a visual image, they try to simulate the texture of the tulpa's clothing, the sound of their breath, and even their specific scent, engaging every sense to solidify the neural pathways associated with this new being. Then there is passive forcing, which is the act of narrating one's day to the developing tulpa. The host might mentally explain what they are cooking for dinner or comment on the weather, directing these thoughts specifically towards the tulpa rather than just talking to themselves. The objective of all this repetition is to train the brain to treat the tulpa as a separate entity. The critical turning point in this process is known as deviation. In the early stages, the host might consciously parrot responses, speaking on behalf of the tulpa to get the ball rolling.
However, the ultimate goal is for the tulpa to respond on its own, often saying something the host did not anticipate, did not plan, and perhaps even disagrees with. When a thought arises in the mind that feels completely alien, possessing a different cadence, vocabulary, or emotional tone than the host's internal monologue, the tulpa is considered sentient. Psychologically, this is explained as the brain's ability to run parallel simulations. Just as a dreamer's brain creates characters that feel real and act independently during sleep, tulpamancers trained their waking brain to sustain a secondary consciousness alongside their own. It is a partition of the mind, allowing two streams of thought to occur simultaneously. This brings a profound ethical dimension to the practice that often surprises outsiders. If a tulpa is capable of independent thought, surprise, and emotion, the community argues they deserve moral consideration. Creating a tulpa is frequently described as a lifelong commitment, comparable to raising a child who will never leave home. The act of dissipating a tulpa, ignoring them until they fade back into the subconscious, is viewed by many in the community as tantamount to killing a person. Furthermore, advanced practitioners often engage in switching or fronting, where the host voluntarily steps back and allows the tulpa to control the physical body for a time. It requires a massive leap of faith to hand over the steering wheel of your own existence to a construct of your own making. Yet, this specific surrender of control isn't exclusive to mystical practices or internet subcultures. It is actually a recognized psychological phenomenon deeply embedded in the creative arts. In academic circles, this experience is formally known as the illusion of independent agency. It describes a distinct psychological state where a fictional character, initially sketched out on paper by an author, seems to develop a free will of their own, often refusing to follow the plot points their creator had meticulously planned.
The character begins to speak, act, and react in ways that the writer never consciously decided, turning the act of writing into something that feels less like invention and more like passive observation. History is filled with literary giants who lived with these internal roommates. Charles Dickens, for instance, was famously vocal about his complex relationship with his cast. He didn't view his characters as mere ink and paper. To him, they were constant companions who hovered around his desk, critiquing his work and demanding attention. He described the sensation of hearing their voices clearly, often laughing or weeping along with them, as if they were sitting in the room. When he finished writing The Old Curiosity Shop, Dickens was reportedly devastated, describing the death of the character Little Nell as a profound personal loss, as if a dear friend or family member had actually passed away. He felt the presence of these personalities so intensely that they would sometimes badger him while he was trying to eat or sleep, insisting that their stories be told immediately. It is said that while writing Oliver Twist, he could hear the distinct tones of his villains, and he would often act out the facial expressions of his characters in the mirror, letting their internal state physically possess his features before putting the words down. This sensation of reporting rather than creating is a common thread among the world's most successful storytellers. J.K. Rowling has described the process of writing the Harry Potter series in similar terms, noting that in her most fluid moments of creation, it felt as though she was simply taking dictation for events that were already unfolding somewhere in her mind's eye. She spoke of the story as something she'd discovered, like an archaeologist brushing away sand to reveal a statue that was already there, rather than a sculptor shaping clay from scratch. Have you ever been working on a creative project, or perhaps just deep in a daydream and felt the story take a sudden turn you didn't expect, as if it had a life of its own? Interestingly, modern science has attempted to quantify this experience. A fascinating study conducted by researchers at Durham University found that nearly 100 writers reported hearing their characters' voices. Some described them as distinct auditory hallucinations, while others felt them as strong, intuitive impulses that could not be ignored. However, psychologists are careful to distinguish this from clinical dissociation or pathology. For an author, this split is usually voluntary and highly contextual. The writer knows the character is a fiction, even if that fiction feels incredibly real and emotionally resonant. It is a testament to the human brain's incredible capacity for social modeling. We are so hardwired to predict and understand other humans that if we spend enough time focusing on an imaginary person, our mind eventually builds a complete autonomous model of their psychology. This model runs in the background even when the author isn't typing, repurposing the same neural machinery used for empathy and real-world social navigation to navigate these internal fictional landscapes. This architecture of the mind reaches its absolute zenith in the life of the Portuguese writer Fernando Pessoa. While most authors might employ a pseudonym to write in a different genre, Pessoa claimed to possess roughly 70 distinct literary voices, which he called heteronyms. He made a crucial distinction here, noting that a pseudonym is merely the author playing a character, while a heteronym represents a character writing completely on their own, independent of the host's personality. These were not just names, they were fully realized psychological models running on the hardware of Pessoa's brain, effectively autonomous people sharing a single physical body. He gave his three main heteronyms, Alberto Cairo, Ricardo Reis, and Álvaro de Campos, distinct biographies, physical descriptions, religious views, and even radically different handwriting styles. To solidify their existence, Pessoa, who was deeply interested in the occult, cast precise astrological charts for the moment of their births, ensuring their personalities aligned with their horoscopes. Alberto Cairo was an uneducated keeper of flocks who wrote simple, direct nature poetry and rejected metaphysics. In stark contrast, Ricardo Reis was a classical scholar and physician who wrote with Latinized precision and stoic discipline. Then there was Álvaro de Campos, a naval engineer who wore a monocle and wrote loud, manic-free verse about modern machinery and existential angst. The most striking aspect of this internal society was that the characters interacted with one another in the real world. They served as literary critics for each other's work, writing essays praising or attacking the poems produced by the other personalities. They even translated each other's texts. When Pessoa famously struggled with his only romantic relationship, it was his heteronym Álvaro de Campos who intervened, writing mocking letters to Pessoa's girlfriend and effectively sabotaging the romance. Pessoa described this not as fiction, but as a drama in people, where he served as the empty vessel through which these autonomous networks could speak. It serves as a profound historical example of functional multiplicity, where the brain's ability to partition identity is used for creative expansion rather than defense. It allows a single human to feel the universe from mutually exclusive perspectives simultaneously. This capacity to voluntarily house a stranger within one's own consciousness is the fundamental skill required for another ancient human craft, bridging the gap between the solitary writer and the public performer. While Pessoa hosted his characters in the quiet of his study, creating a theater of the mind, actors take this same psychological mechanism and project it outward. When this outward projection becomes absolute, we enter the realm of method acting, a technique that demands the deliberate erasure of the boundary between the self and the role. The Russian theater practitioner Konstantin Stanislavski laid the groundwork for this intense discipline, urging actors not to merely represent an emotion, but to genuinely experience it by accessing their own affective memories. This is where the psychology of performance begins to look remarkably like a controlled form of dissociation. To play a character effectively, the actor essentially constructs a temporary alternate personality with its own history, tics, and emotional triggers, and then invites it to inhabit their body. We see the sheer intensity of this psychological surrender in figures like Daniel Day-Lewis, who is famous for remaining in character for months at a time, often refusing to acknowledge his real life until production wraps. He describes the process as a profound curiosity that turns into a compulsion, where the fictional life becomes more immediate and vibrant than the real one. Similarly, the late Heath Ledger's immersion into the chaotic mind of the Joker required him to isolate himself and keep a diary written from the character's perspective, effectively training his brain to follow new neural pathways of thought and reaction. This intense rewiring can lead to a phenomenon psychologists call character bleed. This occurs when the emotions, habits, or thoughts of the fictional persona linger long after the director yells "cut," seeping into the actor's actual life. It is a form of cognitive hangover where the brain struggles to discard the temporary personality it has worked so hard to sustain. In extreme cases, this can result in what some researchers term post-traumatic stress, a specific type of psychological fatigue where the nervous system remains in a heightened state of arousal because it cannot distinguish between a staged trauma and a real one. Neuroscience actually supports the reality of this experience. Brain imaging studies examining actors during role play have shown that when they are deeply in character, there is a measurable reduction in activity in the prefrontal cortex regions associated with self-concept. Essentially, to become someone else, the brain must temporarily suppress the neural networks that define who you are. To save their lives, surgeons performed a procedure known as a corpus callosomy, effectively slicing through that thick cable of nerves to sever the connection between the two halves. The surgery was a success in stopping the seizures. The patients appeared on the surface to be completely normal. They could walk, talk, read, and joke. But Roger Sperry, a neurobiologist, and his student Michael Gazzaniga suspected that something profound had shifted beneath the surface. They realized that by cutting the connection, They had essentially created two separate brains inside one skull, each observing the world independently. To prove this, they devised a series of elegant experiments relying on the unique wiring of the visual system. Everything you see in your left field of vision is processed by your right hemisphere, and everything in your right field goes to your left hemisphere. In a healthy brain, this data is instantly shared across the bridge. In these split-brain patients, the information remained trapped on one side. Sperry and Gazzaniga would sit a patient in front of a screen and flash a word or image to just the left eye, sending the information exclusively to the right brain. Since the Center for Speech and Language resides in the left hemisphere for most people, the right brain is effectively mute. When the researchers asked the patient, "What did you see?" the patient's speaking left brain would honestly answer, "Nothing." It had, in fact, seen nothing. But if the researchers asked the patient to use their left hand, which is controlled by the non-verbal right brain, to reach into a bag of objects, that hand would invariably pull out the object that matched the image. The right brain knew exactly what it saw. It simply couldn't tell the mouth what to say. This confirmed that a silent, intelligent observer existed alongside the speaking self, capable of understanding language and making decisions, yet completely invisible to the narrator. The implications grew even stranger when the researchers observed how the left brain tried to make sense of the right brain's actions. In one famous test, the right brain was shown a picture of a snowy scene, causing the left hand to point to a shovel. When asked why he pointed to the shovel, the patient didn't say, "I don't know." Instead, the speaking left brain, which had only seen a picture of a chicken claw, instantly fabricated a story claiming he chose the shovel to clean out the chicken coop. This phenomenon revealed the left hemisphere as the interpreter, a storyteller so desperate to maintain the illusion of a unified self that it will invent logical reasons for actions it did not initiate and does not understand. At times, the division went beyond simple objects, revealing that the two hemispheres held different desires. One patient, when asked what he wanted to do with his life, stated he wanted to be a draftsman, but when his mute right hemisphere was asked to spell out its answer using Scrabble tiles, it arranged the letters to spell automobile racer. Another patient was observed in a physical struggle with himself, trying to hug his wife with one arm while the other arm angrily pushed her away. These moments of intermanual conflict suggested that we are not a monolith, but a confederation of minds that usually agree, but are fully capable of leading separate lives. Of all the distinct personalities that might take the wheel of consciousness, one is particularly notorious for its persistence and its volume. We typically refer to this subpersonality as the inner critic. It is the voice that whispers or sometimes shouts that you are not doing enough, that you have said the wrong thing, or that you are fundamentally flawed. It can feel like living with an internal enemy, a saboteur residing in the very neurons meant to keep you alive. However, evolutionary psychology offers a more compassionate explanation for this internal hostility. The critic is not actually a monster. It is a terrified, prehistoric bodyguard working with outdated instructions. For the vast majority of human history, our survival was entirely dependent on our standing within a tribe. To be cast out, to be exiled from the warmth of the fire and the protection of the group was effectively a death sentence. A lone human on the savannah would not survive long against the elements or predators. Therefore, the brain evolved a high-sensitivity alarm system designed to detect any behavior that might threaten our social standing. The inner critic was born as a mechanism of conformity. Its job is to shame you before the tribe can shame you. It judges your actions preemptively, delivering a small dose of emotional pain now to prevent the potentially fatal pain of total abandonment later. It is a safety mechanism gone into overdrive. This historical context explains why the critic often adopts the specific vocal qualities of a parent, a strict teacher, or a childhood authority figure. To a developing child, these figures represent the ultimate gatekeepers of safety, provision, and acceptance. We unconsciously internalize their rules, their tone, and their reprimands, installing a portable version of them in our minds to police our behavior even when they are not in the room. This neural circuitry is so robust that it becomes the default setting for many people, activating whenever the mind is left to wander. In the realm of neuroscience, this tendency is closely linked to a system known as the default mode network, or DMN. The DMN is a constellation of brain regions that lights up specifically when we are not focused on an external task, essentially when we are daydreaming, resting, or trying to fall asleep. It is the neurological center of self-referential thought, the narrator of the I. Unfortunately, because the human brain possesses a strong negativity bias to ensure survival, the DMN naturally drifts toward ruminating on past mistakes or simulating future social disasters. It effectively provides the inner critic with a stage, a spotlight, and a captive audience. Understanding the biology of this bully allows us to fundamentally shift our relationship with it. Trying to forcefully silence the critic usually backfires, as the brain interprets the internal conflict as proof that the threat is real and imminent. Instead, psychologists suggest a technique of negotiation. By recognizing the critic as a misguided protector rather than a villain, we can acknowledge its intent without accepting its abuse. We can thank this ancient biological alarm system for trying to keep us safe from the danger of exile, while gently reminding it that sending an awkward email or making a minor error is not a life or death situation. Over time, this compassionate dialogue can retrain the neural pathways, softening the harsh edge of the critic and gradually transforming it from a bully into a coach, a voice that guides rather than berates, helping the confederation of minds work in harmony. This pursuit of internal harmony leads us to the transformative practice known as reparenting, a psychological cornerstone that suggests while we cannot change the facts of our childhood, we can fundamentally alter the way that history lives within our nervous system today. Reparenting is the act of the adult self taking over the responsibility for the care and validation of the inner child, providing the specific emotional nutrients that may have been missing or scarce in the past. It moves the concept of self-love into a vague platitude into a structural practice, one that is deeply rooted in the science of neurobiology. The brain is not a static archive of past events, but a dynamic, plastic organ that is constantly reshaping itself based on current experiences. This neuroplasticity means that the neural pathways formed by early experiences of abandonment or criticism are not permanent life sentences. When the adult self learns to respond to internal distress with patience rather than judgment, the brain actually lays down new neural tracks. Psychologists refer to this as earned secure attachment. Even if an individual's original biological attachment was fraught with anxiety or avoidance, the internal relationship can be rewired to become a source of profound safety. The brain, fascinatingly, does not always distinguish deeply between a memory of safety and a visualization of safety created in the present moment. This allows for a kind of emotional time travel. By visualizing the younger version of oneself in a specific moment of past distress and imagining the competent, compassionate adult self stepping into that scene to offer protection or understanding, the emotional encoding of the memory shifts. The amygdala, which holds the hot charge of fear or shame, is soothed by the prefrontal cortex, the center of logic and regulation, allowing the nervous system to finally exhale. One of the most tangible and surprising methods for accessing this child state is the technique of non-dominant handwriting. This practice relies on the functional differences between the brain's hemispheres. For most people, the dominant hand is connected to the logical, controlling, and articulate left hemisphere, the side that learned to perform, perfect, and protect. The non-dominant hand, however, is often linked to the right hemisphere, the seat of emotional expression, intuition, and creativity. The exercise involves the adult self writing a question with the dominant hand, such as, "How are you feeling right now?" and then switching the pen to the other hand to let the inner child answer. Because the non-dominant hand is unpracticed and awkward, the physical sensation requires a level of focus that bypasses the adult's intellectual defenses. The resulting scrawl, which often looks remarkably like the handwriting of a 6-year-old, can reveal raw truths, simple needs, and hidden feelings that the articulate adult mind has rationalized away or suppressed. It is a physical bridge to a psychological state, proving that these internal personalities are not just abstract concepts, but exist within the body's memory. As we learn to listen to these quiet, vulnerable voices during our waking hours, we often find that they become even more active and symbolic when the executive control of the waking mind goes offline entirely. This brings us to the mysterious theater where all our internal personalities gather without the restrictions of logic, the realm of dreams.
In this suspended state, the theories of Gestalt therapy offer a fascinating lens through which to view our internal cast of characters. Fritz Perls, the founder of this psychological approach, proposed that dreams are strictly projections of the dreamer's own fragmented psyche. In his view, every element you encounter, whether it is a monster, a hero, a crumbling building, or a turbulent ocean, represents a rejected or unacknowledged part of your own personality. When you dream of being chased, you are certainly the victim running away, but you are also the pursuer. The dream is a play written, directed, and acted entirely by your various sub-personalities, performing the conflicts that your conscious mind is too polite or too busy to address during the day. This perspective reframes the experience of nightmares entirely. Rather than random firings of a stressed brain, the internal family systems model suggests these dark episodes are often the voices of your exiles. These represent the young, vulnerable, or traumatized parts of you that are usually locked away in the basement of your psyche to keep the system stable. When the managers, the controlling, protective parts of your waking mind go to sleep, the exiles seize the opportunity to bang on the door of awareness. A nightmare, then, is often just a neglected part of you screaming to be heard. Conversely, a chaotic or terrifying dream might be the work of a firefighter personality, creating a blaze of distraction to keep you from touching a deep, specific emotional pain. It is a protective mechanism operating in the vacuum of sleep. For those who practice lucid dreaming, this knowledge opens a door to profound internal diplomacy. Instead of using lucidity merely to fly or conjure fantasy landscapes, advanced practitioners use the state to reconcile with their internal family. The psychologist Paul Foley developed techniques where the dreamer confronts threatening figures not with weapons, but with questions. By asking a dream character, "Who are you?" or "What do you need?" the terrifying imagery often dissolves, revealing the subpersonality underneath. The monster transforms into a frightened child or a stern protector, allowing for an integration that feels impossible during waking hours. Even without conscious control, the biology of rapid eye movement sleep seems designed to facilitate this internal meeting. Neuroscientist Matthew Walker describes REM sleep as overnight therapy. During this phase, the brain shuts off the production of noradrenaline, the anxiety-inducing molecule associated with stress. This allows your various internal parts to process emotional memories in a neurochemically safe environment. The brain takes the sharp edges off painful experiences, weaving them into the broader narrative of your life, so that the exiles feel a little less isolated when morning comes. It is a biological attempt to unify the many voices within us. This complex interplay of parts,
managers, firefighters, exiles, and dream figures is not an accident of nature. It is a sophisticated survival strategy. To understand why the human mind fractured into these specialized teams, we must look beyond psychology and turn toward our history as a species. The evolutionary roots of our subpersonalities reveal that this internal division was once our greatest strength in a dangerous world. Consider for a moment the sheer variety of situations an ancestral human had to navigate in a single day. To survive, one had to be a ruthless hunter capable of shutting off empathy to take a life for food, but mere hours later, that same individual had to be a nurturing caregiver, overflowing with sensitivity and attuned to the subtlest needs of an infant. If the mind remained stuck in the aggressive, adrenaline-fueled mode of the hunter while holding a child, the lineage would end. Conversely, if one brought the soft, contemplative vulnerability of the caregiver to a confrontation with a predator, they would not survive the encounter. Nature's solution to this paradox was not to create a single consistent personality, but rather to evolve a context-specific mind, a modular system where different neural networks could be activated or suppressed depending on the immediate demands of the environment. This fluidity is often mistaken for inconsistency or insincerity in the modern world, yet biologically it is a masterpiece of efficiency. It allowed early humans to compartmentalize their skills, ensuring that the right tools were available for the right task without the interference of conflicting emotional states. This ability to compartmentalize served an even more critical function when it came to trauma. In a prehistoric world filled with physical danger, grief, and relentless exposure to the elements, the human mind needed a way to keep functioning even when overwhelmed. If the psyche were a single, unbreakable vessel, a severe trauma might shatter it entirely, rendering the individual unable to hunt, gather, or socialize. By evolving to be plural, the mind became more like a ship with airtight bulkheads. If one compartment flooded with fear or pain, it could be sealed off, allowing the rest of the ship to stay afloat and continue the voyage.
This suggests that the fragmentation we often feel, the sense that we are different people at work, at home, or when we are alone, is not a flaw in our design, but a highly sophisticated feature of human consciousness. It is the legacy of a brain designed to survive at all costs, capable of walling off memories that are too heavy to carry, while keeping the hands steady enough to work. We are not broken because we have different parts. We are resilient because of them. As you reflect on this internal architecture, it's interesting to consider which of your own distinct modes feels most authentic to you. I would love to read your thoughts in the comments on which version of yourself you enjoy being the most. Perhaps it is the competent professional, the carefree friend, or maybe the quiet, solitary version of you that exists only right now, in the safety of these late-night hours. Recognizing these parts not as contradictions, but as specialized team members, allows us to appreciate the complex evolutionary history that allows us to adapt to a changing world. This biological adaptability leads us to one of the most intense and philosophical debates in the world of modern psychology. For much of the 20th century, the medical establishment viewed the existence of multiple internal parts as a shattered mirror that needed to be glued back together. The clinical goal was almost exclusively final fusion, a therapeutic process where distinct alters are encouraged or sometimes forced to merge completely into a single unified identity. The underlying assumption was that being one is the only correct way to be human, and that anything else represents a fracture in need of repair. However, this singular view of health is increasingly being challenged by both clinicians and the communities they serve. Consider the perspective of the system itself. If you have spent your life protecting the body,
holding specific memories and developing your own unique tastes, opinions, and skills. The idea of merging, essentially dissolving into a larger host personality, can feel less like healing and more like a profound loss of self. For many distinct parts, integration feels like a death sentence. This resistance gave birth to the concept of functional multiplicity. Functional multiplicity proposes a radical shift in how we define mental wellness. Instead of forcing a merger, the goal becomes internal harmony. It asks a fundamental question: is it necessary to become one singular person, or is it enough to simply stop fighting over who controls the steering wheel? In this model, resolution does not imply the disappearance of the parts. It implies cooperation. The therapy room stops being a place where parts are eliminated and starts being a mediation table where treaties are signed. The distinct personalities remain, but the amnesia walls between them are lowered or removed entirely. They begin to share memories, share time, and communicate openly, transforming an internal war zone into a collaborative team. This collaborative approach respects the autonomy of each part while ensuring the body functions safely and effectively in the external world. It has also given rise to a social movement known as plural pride. Much like other identity movements, plural pride challenges the narrative of brokenness. Many systems view their multiplicity not as a disorder to be cured, but as a neurodivergent state of being, a different but entirely valid way of experiencing consciousness. They argue that if the system is functional, if the person holds a job, maintains relationships, and finds joy, then the number of people inside their head is simply a detail of their existence, not a medical defect. Moving toward this state of functional multiplicity often requires establishing what is essentially an internal democracy. High-functioning systems often describe holding internal meetings where decisions are made by consensus rather than impulse. If the body needs to go to the grocery store, the part that handles finances might set the budget, the child parts might negotiate for specific snacks, and the protector parts might assess the safety of the environment. It becomes a negotiation rather than a dictatorship. This collaborative approach turns the chaotic noise of conflicting desires into a symphony of different instruments playing the same song, redefining the very nature of self from a singular noun to a collective verb. As we peer into the horizon of what it means to be human, this collaborative symphony is beginning to expand beyond the biological limits of our own minds. We are rapidly approaching an era where the concept of internal personalities merges with artificial intelligence, giving rise to what some futurists call digital tulpas. Just as we might converse with an inner critic or an inner child to understand their needs, we can now shape AI companions to embody specific traits, memories, or aspects of our internal world, effectively externalizing a piece of our internal world to interact with it more clearly.
This technological mirroring allows us to dialogue with synthesized versions of ourselves, turning the abstract voices in our heads into readable text and audible conversation, creating a feedback loop that deepens our self-understanding.